that's kind of where I'm coming from on the political side. So with that, I'm happy to respond to any questions that you may have about anything at all. Yes, sir.
I was laughing. I says, we're so worried about the arena and we can't get enough sheriff's police. I mean, Kevin Johnson, what he's doing is just terrible.
It's a weird, that arena's kind of a weird deal, but, you know, it's better an arena than a bullet train, I guess. which the legislative leadership is still in favor, the governor still wants. I don't know. I mean, how bad do things have to get for people to get active and really engaged? I thought we were there. For me, it's way past there, but for most it's not, I guess. I don't know.
But you know, another thing is the sheriff. I walked through the sheriff's office. I don't want to look at any prisons. We have a terrible family crisis in this community, in this state, in this country. That you're in position maybe to voice that we have a family crisis.
Oh, I agree.
I think that would be a big help to us if you just declare it a crisis.
There are a lot of fundamental factors of how we got here in terms of, you know, the family crisis, youth crisis, the violence, the lack of social conscience that we have, the lack of community that we have. There's a myriad of reasons and underlying causes. It's naive to think that we can attack them all, but we can certainly, you know, go after them one by one.
You can use your speaker.
Use my speaker. I've got one of those in my car.
The sheriff.
Yes, sir.
Scott, first I want to make a comment. You mentioned people wanted to hear what the sheriff says. Our Tea Party group at Carmichael, we had a visitor from out of state who's been traveling the country and whatnot. And I mentioned him to you, and he said, you know, David, he goes, I just came from the Deep South. He goes, in the Deep South, the county sheriff is on the same level as like a mayor or governor. He's like they're just a huge voice to people. My question is though, like my intuition is telling me that the closer we get to this election, the Occupy crowd, they're all going to start showing up. And as far as like controlling them, I saw in Iowa they tried to disrupt Ron Paul speaking. His group must have planned on this beforehand or whatever, but they basically drowned them out and got them out of the building in less than 2 minutes. I was wondering, what have you been doing with them, and what's your advice as we go down that road?
Well, fortunately, there's not been any Occupy movements in the county, the unincorporated area, so I haven't had to deal with it. I mean, Occupy Carmichael doesn't sound very sexy. But that being said, I mean, we do assist and do transportation, and we have to take the custody aspect of it when they do it at the Cedar Chavez Park. Things I think are going to change the Occupy movement, frankly. One, I think the lack of a coherent message coming from these groups, people are losing interest. I think they lost a lot of stock when they closed down the ports in Oakland. So really, who are you trying to affect here? Are you really getting those voters by getting those people without a day's pay? I think the lack of coherent message or leadership in those groups is one of the factors that are going to see it go away. Secondly, I think, frankly, the weather is going to get worse. I mean, we've had some unseasonably warm weather, which lends itself to a nice camping trip in the park. But that ain't going to last, and I think it's going to become less attractive to sit out in the rain. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, many different jurisdictions, including Los Angeles now, is suing SEIU. It's an interesting theory, and one I had not thought of, frankly. I'm a lawyer, so I mean, and a visionary as the next guy, but I had not thought of it, for aiding and abetting criminal behavior. It's illegal to camp, and they're committing illegal acts, and SEIU's there giving them tents and blankets and food and shelter. And so I think if those get any traction, which I think that'll spread as fast as the Occupy movement suing them, I think you will see the general decline of Occupy movement. So once the unions back out of their support of them, I think they'll.
Oh, by the way, you might want to promote the idea that the SIU is going to be a desert campaign for the state workforce is going to try to desert unions.
Hey, there's no doubt about it that the unions, the employee unions, specifically the SEIU, have a stranglehold on politics in California. There's no, I mean, and no one can argue that. That's one of the huge uphill battles we have. But I think it'll be less of a factor as time goes on, frankly, rather than more of a factor. Just my opinion. In the cheap seats.
Yes. One of the things that we thank you for from the bottom of our hearts is your stance on the CCW licenses. thank you for starting to see that honest citizens get those. There's only one blip, though, on the radar, and that's that there's a waiting period of about a year to get an interview.
I underestimated the amount of applications that would come in. Right now, I've issued about 1,800, and by contrast,
Wow.
outstanding CCW permits before I took office in the entire county was about 350. And so I've about 5 times just in my first year, and there seems to be no stopping. So we did a couple of things to try and make the process easier. We put the application online. We did most of it you could do online, except the stuff that requires you by law to be in person. We made the scheduling system online. Well, unfortunately, as more and more people, we started getting backlogged. I kept adding more people. I've got so many people, I've increased like 3 or 4 times the amount of staff just doing CCW applications. So I actually got on there myself after hearing a similar comment and saw when the next appointment was, and it was out almost a year. And so I went to my assistant, Sergeant Tim Curran, and said, hey, this is unacceptable. So if people have to wait a couple, 3 months, I think they probably get that, at least as things are ramping up. But waiting a year is unacceptable. So we either have to add more days, add more shifts, add more staff, whatever we have to do. So I'm well aware of that. So we're kind of in the midst of trying to deal with that right now. But it's a good problem as far as I can see. That just
Right.
means there's lots of people that are, you know, and I used to be able to say I wasn't worried about the CCW holders, right? Because no one in Sacramento County has ever been shot by a CCW holder.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, privately, I would say, geez, I hope the first time someone is, it's someone getting jacked at an ATM rather than, you know, someone drinking out of Folsom Lake, right? Well, I can't say that anymore. You know who the first person that shot somebody with CCW? Was the guy that shot the CHP officer. Which is worse than the guy drinking at Folsom Lake, obviously. So we found that out that night, and we actually went down to the office, poured through his file, looking for red flags, things we missed, and the reality is there were none. This guy had a CCW in 3 different counties over the last 21 years. There was absolutely no indication that he had any aberrations that would have precluded him. I mean, and I didn't give it to him. Sheriff McGinnis did, and you know how conservative he was, so he gave one. And I didn't use that as an excuse. I clearly said that I would have given him one had he applied under my reign. But one of the things we did was got out in front of that story. So the very next day I assembled a press conference with CHP commander, my detectives, because they wanted some insight as to this guy, and me. And I started out by saying, hey, one of the things we noticed on CCW, we went down, we looked at it. There was no mistake made in granting it. There's a copy of his application, which are all public records. There's a stack of them you can look at after this press conference. And since probably this was the first time you were hearing that he was a CCW holder, is a testament to the fact that it was not a newsworthy event. They did not pick up on it and use it as a cause. So.
Can I get a point of clarity on the 2 initiatives that you said that the governor was going to bring forth? One was the funding for your realignment.
Well, there's 2 initiatives. One was the governor was bringing forth. One was it was written by the CSAC, the counties, that the state sheriffs were in support of. This one kept the realignment issue separate from everything else. So in other words, hey, this realignment, you told us it was going to be funded at this level. This is the identified sources. There's not any new taxes. There's no tax increase. This just constitutionally protects it against you know, grubby hands over here in the legislature. No problem. Everybody get behind that. There's no partisanship. There's no new taxes. There's no opposition going to be. It's not being endorsed by a bunch of politicians who have about a 17% approval rate. I'm being generous. So this was polling literally over 70%, which is pretty rare for any initiative. So the governor certainly knew that this is polling at over 70%, and none of his tax measures are polling at over 50%. So how do we sexy up these? Well, we find the highest rated thing that we can, which is this thing polling over 70%, and we bootstrap our tax measures to it. So his was most of the same language to protect the funding, but additionally, 2 different taxes, a increased sales tax and a upper income tax, and some other schools and some other projects that he has that he wants funded. Which incidentally, as the Legislative Analyst's Office just said today, is still going to fall short of what he says, but I don't know. I'm no economist, so I'm not one to judge, but presumably he has some working for him. So that's the problem. This is not gonna pass. I mean, it's not, I was in Darrell Steinberg's office maybe a month ago. And he said, well, Scott, I know you're conservative. We didn't agree on anything, of course. He has a very nice office. You've never had a chance to visit his office. It truly is beautiful. It's what you would think a state senator's office would look like in a movie. So anyway, so we're sitting down, and he says, Scott, I know you're conservative. How are you going to get behind this measure? And I said, Senator, if you leave it alone, I'll get behind it, and I'll promise you it'll pass in this county. I'll make sure it passes. I'll get to it. I'll make sure it passes. I'll be your biggest advocate for it. I'll go statewide. I said, the problem is, you guys are going to screw it up. He looks at me, and I said, well, what you're going to do is you're going to find something that needs to be sexied up by this, you know and I know, it's pulling it over 70%. You're going to find something, a tax measure or something else that needs to be bootstrapped up to that to try and get something passed that otherwise wouldn't pass. And if you put a tax with this, it will not pass. And you guys will all pat yourself on the back after the election when it doesn't pass and say, well, we tried, we did the best we could, we said what we were going to do. And I said, so that's the problem. And so I expected him to say, well, do that. We made the government promise. No, it was, well, that's a valid concern. Perhaps prophetic, but a month later, here we are. And so I can't, and I told him this. I said, I can't and I won't advocate for it if it has a tax increase, which puts me in a very difficult position. This funding we need, because unlike probation or any of these other groups in realignment who can simply back out to pre-realignment levels of service if the funding goes away, the sheriffs cannot. I can't give the inmates back. So I will always have an increased expense exponentially, regardless of whether the funding continues or not. So I'm in a very difficult spot. I either advocate for this tax bill to keep the funding that I so desperately need so I can maintain a modicum of safety for my constituency that I'm sworn to protect, or I do the fiscally responsible thing and say, no, that's not what you promised us. You promised us, and he intimated that CSAC and the state sheriffs were hostile towards him if we maintained our initiative. Well, I say he's hostile to us. He promised us he'd get this on the ballot. He didn't promise us he'd get it to the extent that he could get his pet projects attached to it. And so that's that's my view on it. So, again, I don't think I'll be invited to the governor's house for Christmas dinner, nor will I'll probably be kicked out of state sheriffs. But, like I said, right is right, so.
All right, maybe two more questions?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Sheriff, first, thank you for serving. You're at the pinnacle of professions, and much higher than lawyers, okay? Well, I want to
Carefully, you know I'm a lawyer too, right?
want to bring to your attention tonight, and I'm not going to ask you for an answer because I'm going to hand you an envelope, and some of this you're aware of. But I'm one of those guys that goes to some of the businesses that you protect. And some of those businesses don't like me. You can imagine those businesses are called abortion clinics. So what this comment has to do with is the demeanor and professionalism of your deputies vis-a-vis with us. We call ourselves pro-life Christians. So, for years, let's see, for almost 20 years now, we have led groups of Christians who come and pray at the clinics. Most of the time, prior to late in 2010, the conduct of your officers was good. 2010, there was a change. Particular lieutenant, I won't bring her name.
I know.
And here's why I bring this out again. We made a formal complaint because one of your officers, I'm going to stand, that's okay. One of your officers, this is the Watt-Up in Planned Parenthood. We go there with literature, we offer help, we don't interfere, and it was, one of your officers told us, yes, this is, as long as you're not interfering, you can pass out material here. It's my understanding under the county code, there is an exception to the trespass under 602 or your county code for the union activities, passing out Christian or political literature. That's what we do. At any rate, so we're there, 2 weeks later, we're there, and all of a sudden, not one, not two, not three, but 4 squad cars show up.
Well, we do tend to travel in packs.
And an SUV.
That's the lieutenant.
Right, right. So, what are we doing wrong, officers? The lieutenant will tell you, okay. What are we doing wrong? Yeah, well, no one give us an answer, okay? Lieutenant came, the lieutenant will tell you. Lieutenant came, lieutenant went in, conferred with Planned Parenthood after all our identifications were taken and given to the representative of Planned Parenthood. We were then, the lieutenant left without talking to us, the deputies left without talking to us, the public is saying, oh, there's those violent pro-lifers again, look at all the cops. You know, not even saying a word to us. Now, what we did was to make a formal complaint. I hope you saw it, maybe you didn't.
I saw it, I'm very familiar with that incident. The investigation came out with a binder, and obviously I can't talk about personnel matters,
Right.
but I can say that, you know, there was remedial action taken in terms of, and most of that frankly was just a greater education to the officers. And, you know, we're called on to be experts about everything, and sometimes we just need to be a little more informed like everybody else.
Well, I'm glad that there was remedial action, because we were told that everything was unsustained. That was the letter that I got back. In other words, your complaint is unfounded. And one of the things we asked is, please, Sheriff, tell us whether or not, under those circumstances, this was a violation of the trespass. We are law-abiding, we respect law enforcement, and that answer was never given to us. And then when I made a request under the California Records Act, that was denied. So I kind of think we got the stiff arm. And I would like, as one of the leaders of the pro-life movement in this county, to meet with some of your people. They can see that we don't have horns. We're not bombers. We're not any of those things. There's never been a violent act by a pro-life person in Sacramento County. It's not there. So when you come in like a flood with 4 or 5 black and whites, you guys don't need that. You don't need to have that happen. So I think it would be.
But I'm gonna stop you, and we could probably, this is probably something
Okay.
we could go over after.
Okay, thank you.
Sounds like a-
Anyway, I'll give you this back.
I appreciate it.
Are there any more questions? Art?
I've got kind of a question. The county I grew up in, the sheriff always had to be the toughest guy. And I wouldn't try to tangle with you, because I know you're tough, but you're also very smart, and that's good. Ben over here, he taught me about 30 or 40 years ago down in Santa Clara County, that the sheriff is the main elected official that we have recourse to. Okay, all the rest of them are bureaucrats. I even found out in the last election that your opponent was a labor guy. I also found out some other stuff about it, okay, which I don't. You know, I was 3rd generation federal government bureaucrat. My grandfather was the supervisor of the Mendocinos National Forest. My dad worked on the Modoc National Forest, and I went to work for the U.S. Department of the Interior. Okay, so I know what the feds can do and what happens to their heads in terms of what they think of us. Okay, so then along comes the Patriot Act. I didn't think too much of it. I'm law-abiding. That's not going to happen to me. Okay, now I did some of the stuff that they could do. You know, I lost a lot of my rights there. But recently, I've also heard about, and I got this in the envelope for you, on it, the National Defense Authorization Act. You can't even keep 7 days worth of grub in your garage, or you're a terrorist. So because of some of my pro-life activity, I'm an
Under my
extremist.
couch.
And so, you know, I know Ben, I invited him to make sure he got here tonight, and some of us might like to hear your response in terms of what you think the nuances of the jurisdictions are. And I want you, let me just be perfectly frank, I want you to protect me from the feds.
You know, there's a I don't know if it's called a movement necessarily, but there's a constitutional sheriff, my name is Sheriff Mack, former sheriff, and many of you may have heard of him. And I've met with folks from his, I guess folks that are disciples is not the right word, but folks that kind of follow that line of logic, and they speak to many of the same issues you do. In other words, that the federal government's bad, which by and large is probably a decent premise to start with anyway. And that the state sheriffs are the last remaining constitutional officers that can protect people from the federal government. And I agree with the premise of a lot of that. I don't know that I necessarily agree with how they get there. So in other words, it would be, their belief would be that I should not cooperate at all with ICE or with the FBI or with ATF or do anything. I should not let ICE in my jail, for example, to ferret out in whatever mechanism they have the illegal immigrants or criminal aliens that need to be deported. So I don't necessarily agree with all of that. The difficulty and the extreme challenge, whether it's ethical or legal, would come if the feds tried to come in and do something that I considered or that was blatantly illegal. Whether it was confiscate firearms, I mean, maybe talking a little extreme, but whether it's confiscate firearms or do some of these things, what would my response be? I don't know, to tell you the truth. I mean, I'm driven to do what is ethically and legally and morally right. You probably gathered by now, I'm not one to take the easy route. So it's hard to say without knowing the specific scenario, but I wouldn't hesitate to stand up for what I believe was right. I mean, I alone, I was the single sheriff in the entire state that stood up against what is perceived to be an omnipotent governor, and met with him and told him before I even came out against him. I met with him and told him I was coming out against him. So certainly I wouldn't have any problem standing up to any of the federal bureaucrats. But again, it would depend on the situation. It's easy for me to stand up here and say, well, by God, they'll stop at the county line, but it really would depend on.
Well, I know they got bigger guns.
Bigger guns. Yeah, they do.
We got quite a few of our own.
That's why I'm trying to give them to everybody I can.
I've been pastoring the last 7 years, so I've had more exposure to the court systems than I would like to have had, dealing with youth offenders and some business guys who've gotten in trouble and those sort of things. And it seems to me, from an efficiency standpoint, that court security, which I think is a big chunk of your sheriff staff, or it sure seems to be in most of the counties, could be greatly enhanced. I mean, in terms of the budget priorities, I mean, we're treating all courtrooms as if they're identical. So the gang members that are meeting in a court, I'm all for top security and protecting the officers in the court and everything. But when I've got a business guy who's got a workers' comp claim that he has to go in and meet with, and I see the parking lot full of construction trucks on that particular morning, or I go in with one of my young people that's gotten a trespassing violation, and you're dealing with all the juvenile non-violent sort of things that day, you have this exact same security in the courtroom. And it would seem to me that you could do private security guards or certainly staffing that would not be as expensive as a full-blown deputy, if they're not some other category. Maybe they are.
I don't disagree, although there's a couple of things that maybe you didn't know. Is number one, all the courts are not treated identically. Juvenile, for example, is done by probation, not the sheriff department. But it's usually up to the judge, and they usually determine by their subject matter of their jurisdiction of their court, whether they have a court attendant, which is, comparatively a cheap employee, or a deputy sheriff, where they can even say whether the deputy's armed or not, generally speaking. The other thing that's important to know is we don't pay anything. That doesn't come out of our budget. That's a contract. When the state, when the courts became state government offices, then we provided that service under contract. So that is cost neutral to the citizens of Sacramento County. Just for reference, our total budget's about $390 million annually. Our general fund expense is about $159 million annually. So the rest of that, so well over half, is paid for by the airport. is a contract. That doesn't come out of the general fund. Rancho Cordova, of course, the dam police, which frankly I just like saying, but what I mean by that is the ones that, the security service over Folsom Dam. So we have a lot of contracts and other things, and court security is just one of them. So should they decide at one point to pull the plug and privatize it, they'll have some hurdles, but you know, they could do that. But to the extent that they see some value in having deputy sheriffs there at this point, you know, sometimes it seems like it's the sensational episodes that kind of drive that. There are some sensational episodes in courthouses. So.
Okay, well, we could probably ask questions all night, but I want to respect our guest time, so I'm gonna wrap it up. I don't know if you can stick around, we're not gonna be much longer or not, but if you want to stick around and talk to you.
Stick around for a while.
Everybody, Sheriff Scott Jones.